Okay, I am talking to Lyndall Gordon, who has just published a biography of Emily Dickinson called Lives Like Loaded Guns, Emily Dickinson and Her Family's Feuds. Great to see you, Lyndall.
Great to see you. And I must say a big thank you to you, Martha Nell, because when I came a stranger to stay in D.C. for a year during the last year when I was revising the book and finding out still new things at that stage, you were such a good friend to me. I mean, we no sooner met than I felt we became friends. And you were such a support and had such an open mind for discussion that it was an absolute unexpected delight.
Well, it's reciprocated. We really, we met about a year and a half ago, and we really hit it off. And
we did.
We started a conversation that I think is going to last for many decades.
It's going to last.
Yes. So I wanted to talk with you a little bit about your Dickinson biography.
Right.
And I guess my first question is, how did you come to decide that you wanted to write about Emily Dickinson?
I'm afraid it's a long story. I don't know if I can do it quickly. My mother, I must thank my mother, because she was a poet and an unpublished poet, and she didn't want to publish. She felt alien to her time. But she was a very keen reader of poetry, and she adored Emily Dickinson as well as Emily Bronte. I think they were her two favorite poets. And she had a very strong mystical streak, a visionary side to her, which responded very greatly to Emily Dickinson's immortality poems. The Colossal Substance of Immortality, that was my mother's sort of poem. But she did read to me as a child some of the nature poems. A Bird Came Down the Walk, and the Snake poem, Zero at the Bone. Then I came to America when I was a graduate student in 1965. I was at Columbia, and the course there was focused on 19th century American literature, which I loved. And of course, I remember a report I did on Emily Dickinson in the late 60s, in which I argued passionately that we used Final Harvest at that time.
Oh, okay.
And I knew Johnson had done a great job, but I felt passionately that the typography was wrong. That I'd looked, I somehow knew that there were all these dashes in different directions. I was very interested in her use of the dash, and I did my report arguing that we've got to find a different way to publish her.
So the dash is going up and down.
They're going up and down.
Some of them long, most of them short.
Short, going in different directions.
Some of them even have a little curve.
Oh, really?
Yeah, one or two. Yeah.
And
I Dwell in Possibility. It dances up at the end of that line.
Does that really?
Yes.
Well, I did have, looking back to my student report, I did see that I did have one of the central ideas that are to do with poetry in the book. I actually had a spell in hospital. In about 1966, I'd had a very serious postpartum depression, and I'd been given 15 shock treatments, which was the way they treated it in those days. And I remember reading in hospital Emily Dickinson's Perception of an Object Costs Precisely Object's Loss. It's not a poem that I've found easy to talk about in public. In fact, I've given up because it's so theoretical. It's a distillation of four views of perception. But reading that poem, I realized that I was plunging my own interpretation into it from my extreme hospital experience. But I realized that it was such a perfect distillation on the subject of perception, and very advanced, because she's bringing in the uncertainty principle of Heisenberg, which hasn't been yet invented.
Sure.
But she succinctly, in very brief statements, says the object absolute. She talks about the impossibility. It has a perfectness that situates so far. She wrenches the grammar. She invents perfectness, but it's almost, I thought at the time, it's a theorem that she's distilled from experience that will work in any situation, and that every reader should be plunging their own experience into it and filling it out.
That
and
makes
that it
great
would work
sense.
for everyone.
Yes.
So, so that idea of a theorem there, and particularly her use of the dashes, spacing, pushing words apart, allowing the reader in, was
Right.
very central to my view of her.
Very good.
So that came then, and then I suggested Emily Dickinson to editors, you know, several times in the 80s and 90s, and that's in England, where it would just be as though shutters were coming down. They weren't interested. And something has changed in the English culture since then. In 2005, when I, you know, picked it up again and
Right.
suggested the subject, I had an editor who was terribly keen. And it seemed to me now, this year the book was published, that certainly I can't tell, I'm not going to make generalizations about America, because how can I know? But in England, it felt like there was rave after rave about Emily Dickinson from the reviewers of all kinds. They weren't academic on the whole.
Right.
They were general readers, but somehow she had surfaced into public consciousness. And now I'm doing lots of literary festivals all over England.
So there's a great interest
And there's
in
a great
Dickinson.
interest, tremendous assent to the poet and how thrilling she is.
Mm-hmm.
So it's as though there's been a cultural change I can't explain. Because, of course, her reputation's been expanding and expanding.
Yes.
And it's still going. That's what I feel.
Yes. Well, I know in the 2000s I've spoken on Dickinson several times
Yes.
in England, and there does seem to be keen interest.
There is keen interest.
Now, I think your first biography was of Woolf, correct?
No, it was of T.S. Eliot.
T.S. Eliot,
and
okay.
in some way, I feel that Eliot was a good preparation, because
Right.
I feel that, well, Eliot in his early years and Emily Dickinson all the way through, they're not so compelled by traditional religion.
Right.
Eliot did become traditional,
Yes,
certainly,
he did.
later, after his conversion. But in his early years, I think that he was very interested in religious experience of an extreme kind.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that Emily Dickinson, too, is, well, she's got this marvelous quatrain, faith is a fine invention when gentlemen can see, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency.
In an emergency, yes.
And yet she has this guest with a capital G. This guest is making incursions into her consciousness and giving her that sense of immortality.
Yes.
And she's, I think that she's like Eliot in that she's working on a frontier where words fail but meaning still exist. I'm quoting Eliot from one of his essays, The Music of Poetry, in 1942. And having worked on Eliot in that way, it helped me to, as it were, enter Emily Dickinson's dashes.
Yes.
Into those spaces where I think in tandem with Eliot, there is that sense of something beyond words.
That makes great sense.
Does it make sense?
It makes a lot of sense.
I'm sorry, I've got a cough.
That's okay.
Excuse me.
Well, from my reading, because I've read, I think, every biography of Dickinson, and I will say that yours, in this biography, you give us an Emily Dickinson who breathes.
Oh,
and
I'm
you
so
know
pleased.
whom I'm quoting there. I'm quoting her and her first letter to Thomas Higginson. Can you tell me if my verse is alive, does it breathe?
Wonderful.